we are going to embark now on session number 5. Slide, please. Just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about tonight. We are going to do a recap of the weapons of institutions in repressing our voices, address some strategies or introduce some strategies to take on that repression, take on the weapons of the institution. And then we'll revisit some of the vignettes we brought up last week and break into small groups to do some skill practices together. Next slide. So in this first part, we're just going to do a quick overview of the weapons of the institution. So I've become very familiar with these as a person who is now on my 7th round of investigations at UCSF for my various speech in support of Palestinians and being critical about the US-sponsored genocide, Israeli genocide in Palestine. And these are something that I have experienced in various forms throughout my career at UCSF. So I'm a professor of medicine at University of California, San Francisco. And I've been working in the work around colonialism in health for quite a while now, and working with different groups of marginalized peoples, understanding their struggles in the health system and outside in our societies and the impacts those struggles have on health outcomes. And I've experienced all of these things, and so we can speak a little bit about them in more detail, but just as an overview. These weapons of the institution, which include institutional gaslighting, the construct of professionalism in medicine, the weaponization of DEI, and I would say the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, as well as lawfare. These kind of the suite of weapons are ways in which the genocide in Gaza has been really precipitated by obstructing our voices as healthcare workers. It is so patterned throughout medical institutions across the West, not just even in the United States, but in the UK, in Germany, in Canada, in Australia. It is so stereotyped in medical institutions across the West that we started to understand in conversation between Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta and I, as he was getting attacked in Gaza and I was getting attacked at UCSF, we started to see that these things were actually connected. And as we talked with more and more of our colleagues, including Yipeng up in Canada and other folks around the West, we were starting to notice that this was a pattern. As Israel was targeting the healthcare system in Gaza to accelerate the annihilation of the Palestinian people, and this is well documented in the ICJ submissions. As that was happening, the targeting of healthcare infrastructure in Gaza, as well as the targeted attacks on healthcare workers in Gaza, was tied to the repression of healthcare workers across the West. And that two-pronged attack, so killing folks there and silencing them here, is what Dr. Abu Sitta characterized as a framework called the Genocide Enablement Apparatus. The Genocide Enablement Apparatus requires that those of us who are professionally and morally obligated to speak out against this kind of violence, of genocide in any context, but especially where our tax dollars are actually funding the genocide. So having that part of agency became extremely imperative for doctors in the United States and healthcare workers in the United States, as well as healthcare workers across the West, to be speaking out against the genocide. If we had our voices obstructed, it allowed the avalanche of solidarity, what Dr. Mads Gilbert calls the avalanche of solidarity to stop the genocide. It prevents that avalanche. And that is very much a calculated approach. And we know it's calculated because it's happening in a patterned way across all these medical institutions, but also now we're seeing universities and other professional situations where, it's not just medicine, but medicine is particularly important because the role in which the attack on healthcare has played in this particular genocide. So institutional gaslighting is what it sounds like, is saying, that's not really a genocide. That's not really, it's complicated. They're both sides. It's actually not complicated. When there's a genocide, when children are being killed, when doctors are being tortured to death, that's actually not complicated. That's very clear. Those kinds of violences we should always be standing out against in every context, especially the violences against our own colleagues and professionals. The construct of professionalism is a really important weapon that's been used against me. So I've been called unprofessional. I've been called a bully. I've been called, the way that I will name, people who have not lived up to their jobs to, speak out about health equity, and asking why are they so silent, and why is the head of the Journal of the American Medical Association publishing the editor publishing an article, Wynia's infamous article that was trying to create some sort of moral ambiguity about bombing hospitals. So starting to name the ways in which the medical system is complicit, and to be very specific and pointed about it, has been, called unprofessional. Or bringing up in the hospital setting or in the clinical setting, let's talk about this on an anti-racism forum in our professional settings, let's talk about this genocide, to be labeled as unprofessional. To be upset about our colleagues being murdered, to be emotionally harmed, and to feel that harm, that has also been, framed as unprofessional. So we need to start pushing back on what those constructs are. The weaponization of DEI, and I would say Title VI specifically of the Civil Rights Act in the United States, is a major thing that needs to be now fought in the courts. And because the ways in which right now people of great privilege and many people who are socialized as white in this society are using Title VI as a way to silence people of color and their allies who are speaking up about people of color being annihilated in Palestine. And it's being done through the language of safety. I don't feel safe if you talk about the genocide, or, if you're talking, I remember at UCSF, there was a chief resident, Dr. Keith Hansen, who on his last, chief resident grand rounds shared, actually, my name is Keith Hosseini, and I'm actually Palestinian. And he's someone who looked white, or everyone thought was white. And in his chief resident talk, he went and gave, after a 7-year residency in general surgery, he went and talked about the medical apartheid and the situation in Gaza. And the professors of surgery there, apparently had tried to get him sacked right at the end of his residency program. They were unsuccessful. But one thing they had expressed to other faculty is that they said he was calling us baby killers by sharing the data on the children who were being killed in Gaza. That was then flipped and framed as he's calling us baby killers. So this sort of fragility, we call it white fragility, white tears. That's how we've labeled and discussed it in the context of the movement for Black Lives, is the way in which privileged classes will enshrine their privilege by making it a horrible and terrible thing if you start to name the way that privilege enacts violence. And so this has become a very important part of the civil rights struggle that we're living with right now as we think about Mahmoud Khalil and his disappearance, the ways in which universities are collaborating with apparently former Israeli intelligence officers. The dean of his school at Columbia was a former Israeli intelligence officer, as well as, as high as the White House, to start whisking off people who they disagree with politically in speech. So it doesn't even have to be you've done something illegal. If we just disagree with the character of your speech, like what you're saying, that is a huge problem. And this is something that we have to recognize, and when it's happening to us, and also how we can start to organize and protect ourselves collectively. The last one is lawfare, which is basically using the law to try to silence you, which has happened to several people across the United States, and is something, again, that is part of a struggle that we must take on together. An important thing I just want to share as we go through this particular, actually all of our Cultivating Courage curriculum, is to recognize the strategies that we're sharing with you start here as an individual, start in you, to learn how to recognize these things, to learn how to address them and pivot. But there are some things, these things should not happen in isolation. They cannot happen alone. We cannot be quiet about the repression we're facing. Daylight is what helps this stuff this is part of our fight. Daylight is what allows us to use these things that are coming at us from these institutions in a jiu-jitsu manner, where their aggression becomes something that we as a movement can push back and use for our collective liberation. Because when our voices are liberated, when our ability to speak out about what we're seeing and witnessing is liberated, we can start engaging in the work of ensuring this genocide stops, and moving for the liberation of the Palestinian people and all of our people.
Introduction to the strategy. So remember, last time what we practiced was recognizing, right? Just recognizing that it's happening, right? So you're not in it, but you're outside of it. And what we're going to do today is we're going to focus on what do we do once we recognize that we're in a situation where we are, well, the target of institutional weapons to try to shut us down and quiet us. And as Rupa talked about, as part of the Genocide Enablement Apparatus, prevent the avalanche of overwhelming support that's necessary from our specific professional class, healthcare workers, that is necessary to end genocide. Next slide, please. So it's really helpful to keep in mind that our strategies, all of the ones that we're going to talk about today, to disarm the weapons of the institution, they're all rooted in liberatory values and trauma-informed principles. So in this way, the strategies that we're going to offer today will address the cognitive, the psychological, as well as the structural violence of the tactics used against us as healthcare workers within our medical institutions. Liberatory values can anchor us and can also act as sails that keep us moving forward and prevent us from getting stuck in paralysis, especially as violence and repression increase around us. So some of the liberatory values that are really important to keep in mind and anchoring back into, and these are just a few of them. For example, we study our predecessors, right? Those who have gone before us in this work. Healthcare workers come from a long lineage of social justice activists. And this is like international when you study, especially in Palestine. So we study our ancestors, we study our predecessors in the movement for liberation, and we recognize this and we learn from what they have taught. We take the wisdom of our elders. We recognize that a harm to one of us is a harm to all of us. And we have a very concrete example of this right now and what's happening with Mahmoud Khalil, right? We recognize this, we have learned this value. The harm to any one of us is a harm to all of us. We also understand that freedom will come from the people, right? It's going to come from us mass mobilizing and bringing our liberation into existence, right? It's going to come from the ground up, from the people, from the community. This is why we're so focused on resisting fragmentation, promoting communication, empathic bonds. The stronger we are together as communities, the more powerful our movement becomes. And that's how freedom is achieved, not top down. Laws that support liberation follow, right? The movement. Liberation in and of itself, and this is really important to remember, that liberation is inevitable because people will always resist their oppression. In all different forms, people will always resist their oppression. And in that is a very core truth. And sometimes we forget this, but you know what? Those who are trying to keep us colonized and who keep us oppressed, they know that this is true. And this is why they are so intense and hostile and strong when they come at us, because they know how powerful we can be. They know what's right around the corner if they let up. So liberation is inevitable. We will always struggle, and it's a matter of time. This is why we say within our lifetime for Palestine. We've never been closer. No act is too small. This is really important to remember in the movement work when you are just getting started, when you're trying to figure out where you fit in, what can you offer. Even the smallest act of resistance will not be begrudged, right? Every effort matters. All of us have value that we can bring. So these are also, you can think of them like affirmations in a way, but these are truths, right? And so these are part of our liberatory values that we can anchor into. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, trauma-informed principles. So many of us may be familiar with the 6 key principles of trauma-informed care. And this is really important because if you look at those 6 key principles, it really reinforces liberatory struggle. And so 2 things that I find really, really important to highlight is the concept of community and the concept of accountability. So as a reminder, structural violence that plays out within a medical setting specifically deploys abusive power dynamics. So think about the leveraging of fear, instilling of a sense of helplessness and lack of agency, convincing us that things are hopeless, that they're always going to be this way, they can never be other than what they are, right? Abusive power dynamics like this rely on isolating the victim. So think about retaliation where the healthcare worker is isolated and cut off from colleagues, right? So isolating the victim and ensuring secrecy of the harm or abuse enacted. Now, you just heard the description of bringing the harm to daylight, not allowing it to be concealed and hidden. This is a really important point. And I think this is also where our power is, because you're no longer isolated, but you're bringing it to the community. And in that, in and of itself, in breaking that isolation and that secrecy, you can think of it like it automatically challenges the impunity with which medical institutions can continue to harm. So for those of us facing retaliation, it is absolutely necessary to insist on connection in community. This means connecting with allies in the community who are also mobilizing and identifying your sources of support outside of the work environment. Because you may become isolated at your work environment, and that will be engineered as part of the tactic, right, of repression. So find your supports, your nourishing supports, your empathically validating supports outside of your work environment. Figure out who they are. If you have them within the work environment too, tune into those, but especially for those who don't have a lot of support in the work environment. It's also essential that we recognize, once again, as part of abuses of power, thrives on impunity, right? And so that's why, and we'll have a couple examples as we move towards the, right before we get to the breakout sessions, we'll move through a couple vignettes that will show this challenging of the impunity, challenging of the secrecy. Next slide, please.
Sophia, pardon me. Can you go back just one slide? So one of the things I just wanted to highlight, if that's okay, is this use of the word safety, because it came up when we were talking about DEI, right? So the weaponization of DEI in Title VI right now is around this word safety. Like, I don't feel safe. You talking about the rights of Palestinians makes me not feel safe. You talking about the rights of people not to be murdered makes me feel unsafe. This is the same logic that made people so upset when Colin Kaepernick took a knee, like him taking a knee in protest of Black people being killed by police in the United States. They're disproportionately Native American and Black people targeted by the police in police killings. The sense of safety here is does not include. We should talk about comfort. Like, we want people to know that they might sometimes feel uncomfortable. with the things that come up. And as we involve ourselves in trauma-informed processes of building accountability, building our networks and webs of community to resist institutional repression, we are going to come across some discomfort. And how do we, as a group of people, work through that and build our solidarity through discomfort? And that's not the same thing as being unsafe. And so I just wanted to, I don't know if you want to talk more about for us through your expertise on that, but that word has become a tricky one.
Yes, thank you for saying that. So in the context of weaponization, exactly everything you said. In the context of trauma-informed care in clinical care, we actually interpret that safety as healthcare workers doing everything we can to create an environment in the healthcare setting in which patients can experience safety. The patients will tell us, will decide if they feel safe. We cannot impose safety on somebody. We can do everything we can to create an environment that is inclusive, that is welcoming, that provides what is necessary for the process of healing. In mental health care, for example, we're very careful not to declare safety. The patients will decide if they feel safe or not, and that will be different from one person to another, even in a group setting. So absolutely. So institutional gaslighting. So the next couple slides, we'll look at the institutional gaslighting and the construct of professionalism. And we'll specifically offer strategies to confront those with courage. So the weaponization of anti-Semitism, safety, we just mentioned, the weaponization of inclusion. These all kind of fall under the heading of institutional gaslighting generally. And so we're going to subsume them in this moment just to illustrate the approach in general to how to deal with gaslighting. So gaslighting has two parts. There's a cognitive part and there's an emotional part. The first step is to do what you started practicing last week, right? Recognize it when it happens. This is the cognitive part. So for example, being accused of anti-Semitism and being accused of creating an environment that makes others feel unsafe, these are two of the most predictable and common forms of gaslighting used against healthcare workers right now. Once you've recognized the content, the accusation, let's say, okay, pause and name your emotions. Like pay attention to and name your emotions. This step will actually help you separate from these emotions. And this is important because when you can identify that you're having feelings of guilt, confusion, perhaps fear, you're less likely to act on those feelings automatically without first thinking about what the situation actually calls for. So for example, instead of immediately apologizing for something you didn't do because you have a rush of guilty feelings that have welled up, you can recognize that gaslighting is a psychological tactic that imposes the feeling of guilt onto you, along with the accusation for which there is no merit. Once you can name the gaslighting itself, then you can regroup, you can ground, you can reject the accusation confidently because you can see it for what it is. And then you can actually take the step to reframe it as an enabling technique of genocide and continue your advocacy without being repressed. So at no point do you actually engage in a debate on the merits of the accusation, right? Rather than defending yourself to disprove the accusation, you assert your reality, define your own point of engagement, reassert what you know to be true and authentic. A great learning resource on this, in this moment, is Muhammad Al-Qurd's book, Perfect Victims. So check that out. There's a ton of learning on this concept in that. Next slide, please. If it's possible, can we try to play this? It's an Instagram clip.
Can you see
the
it?
one right here on the one on the top where he's speaking. Yeah.
I'm just
Palestinians.
I'll replay it 1 second.
Okay.
where you are not allowed to refer to Israel as a racist endeavor. In other words, Palestinians must not be allowed to articulate what is the core reality of their experience for the last century. And that's what this is all about. I mean, I think smarter Zionists and Zionist lobbyists recognize that, simply expecting Western media to do Israeli propaganda is a big ask, although certain outlets seem to be prepared to do it. But on the whole, as long as you can make it contested, it's an issue, it's a debate. And it's not about apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. As long as you keep it on that terrain, you're safe. And the greatest weapon to do that is to keep the victims on the back foot by accusing. So we're in a situation where basically the racists accuse the victims of racism, and it just turns the whole thing on its head and leaves people sort of dizzy and disoriented. I mean, it's actually Article 7 of the IHRA definition, where you are not allowed to refer to Israel as a racist endeavor. In other words, Palestinians must not be allowed to articulate what is the reality of their experience.
So that really explains the point, right, of the gaslighting and how it really functions. So the construct of professionalism, the weaponizing of professionalism, specifically the stretching of the construct of professionalism to encompass the actions of healthcare workers advocating for Palestinian rights that medical institutions seek to repress. This is a major tactic used over and over again. Many of us have examples of this as the stated rationale behind reprimanding, censoring, threatening with disciplinary action, demoting, suspending, or even employment termination. Many of us here today relate to having professionalism weaponized against us. Now, recall from last week, the brilliant explaining and understanding that we had. Recall the construct of professionalism is rooted in maintaining white supremacy. So when you have these frameworks to understand the situation, it starts to make sense and it can be very predictable, and you're no longer moved by it because you recognize it. And the more you do this, the sooner you'll recognize it, the better you'll get at it, like any skill. Again, there's so much repetition because these are predicted, and these are the same tactics used again and again. So when facing the weaponization of professionalism, the first step, again, is to recognize it as a tactic and not an authentic argument against you, because there is no merit in it. It's a tactic to stop you from whatever action you were doing that was impactful, right? So speaking, educating, wearing clothing that affirms Palestinian life and solidarity, organizing a fundraiser, whatever it is, if it was impactful, you may be facing this kind of attempted repression. So just like in gaslighting, refuse to accept the premise and actually challenge it. There's no legitimate merit to the stretching. It may even come across, honestly, as outrightly absurd in some cases, right? So in my case, for example, as a DEI clinical consultant, teaching about the impact of genocide on transgenerational trauma within BIPOC communities was deemed unprofessional. Okay, absurd. The list of steps to take outlined here on this slide are helpful ways to confront the accusation and to demand accountability in the process. And so we're actually going to go through this in more detail in the vignettes. The core part here is this: we are placing the onus for defending the accusation onto the institution, and that shifts the power dynamic. Force the institution to defend its position in written form. It will often be indefensible. It will come across as absurd. In this way, you are not backed into a corner defending yourself unnecessarily, and you also have a written communication, a written record that you may use if need be in legal advocacy in the future. Next slide, please. Well, before we go to the part 3, which Morgan, if you'd like to do these slides versus let me know if I should. Anybody want to add anything? Rupa, Morgan, from part 2?
No, this was great. Thank you, Asfia.
Yeah, I think it was really great. The only thing I would add is that we're trying to give kind of a broad theory, like ways to sort of approach, like strategies that can be applied in many different contexts. But also, I think like what Dr. Asfia said about getting a written record is really important. Like these are kind of like the theory of how to respond, like challenging the premise or learning to name what's happening and to recognize the gaslighting and like take a step back and name the feelings that it generates to sort of recognize the process, which is kind of like a theoretical response. But there are also very practical strategies that are important to think about, like making sure things are documented in writing, like asking for stuff in writing, or if you make a request, send it on a school email account or on an institutional email account. And I think everybody in this group, and not only the folks who've been facilitating, but also the participants probably have a lot of great kind of practical strategies to share. Like, for example, Dr. SV suggested like one can take notes during a meeting. Like if you're not allowed to record a meeting that's happening, you can take notes, kind of like the minutes of the meeting, and then send the written record to everyone who participated as a way of kind of like accountability. So we can also kind of as a larger group brainstorm and sort of list these practical strategies that fit under these larger conceptual frameworks we've started to develop. And Dr. Asfia and Dr. Rupa, if you guys want to go through the vignettes or if we want to do it as a group, whatever your preference is.
All right.
I will say, I will actually have one thing to add that you just triggered, Morgan. This is how our conversation started, because we all just basically hung out for a while. We're like, no, we should be teaching this stuff. When you experience, so one of the first groups that experienced repression at UCSF were a group of pediatrics residents who focus on health equity. And they were invited to give a grand rounds, and they were reluctant to do it for a couple of years. And eventually they were like, okay, we'll give a grand rounds on our program, which was called the Plus program. And they gave a grand rounds, a beautiful grand rounds, talking about all the various things they do to support advancing health equity in the pediatric population of the Bay Area. And as they were talking about their work, this was in October of 2023, they put up a slide about what was happening to the children in Gaza at that time. And so they were talking about the population of Gaza, 50% of them being children, the impact of complete siege on the children, and then the number of casualties at that time, I think, which already numbered up to like 1,500 or something. And at that time, during that lecture, during that grand rounds, the head of the medical department of pediatrics walked out, Raphael Hirsch, walked out and then sent a department-wide email shaming them for what they did, saying that was just the wrong place to bring up a geopolitical thing that has nothing to do with what we're doing here. And the residents came to meet with me, and they had the feelings of shame. They were crying and they were upset. They were traumatized. And that when we process those feelings, that's one part. But then they didn't go like the next step. And my question to them was, well, what's next? Like, what do we do? So I've come to understand, after experiencing many hits now from the institution and also supporting many friends going through this, is that even though it's hard and it's not what you would want, and I'm not advising you to go out and get hit by your institution, every moment they do this is actually a form of a gift for the movement, because what it starts to do is exposes the tentacles of power and how far they reach. So for myself, I wouldn't know about the Diller Foundation, UCSF's largest donor, who makes their money making Black and brown people unhoused in the Bay Area, and then send their money to Israel to go bomb people there. They build our hospital at UCSF while they bomb the hospitals in Gaza. Right? So the billionaire class, who has this political mind view of the world, is a part of my repression, is a part of my institution. They have ties with a senator in California, Scott Wiener, who's been personally harassing and attacking me and unleashing death threats and rape threats for months. And so seeing that, I'm like, what are the relationships between the University of California, San Francisco, and these people? And so I just share that to say, although it's scary when you experience it on your own, when you can develop a community of care and a community of resiliency, which now is a web of us around the world, then we start to compare notes. And what we're starting to see is the architecture of power that is global and is leading to the kinds of the shredding of our constitutional rights, the shredding of our civil rights in order to keep a genocide going. And so these things, that's what I mean by the jujitsu. As it happens to you, take care. And how do we create the care for ourselves? How do we recognize what's happening, understand the matrices of power, and then start to map it? This is an opportunity to see what has been made invisible, to render the invisible visible so we can actually take it on together. So that's just the last thing I wanted to share with that before we get into the vignettes.
No, that's wonderful. And, I kind of conceptualize that as when we resist the fragmentation that capitalism demands of us, right, in the service of imperialism, what does it do? It cuts us off from connecting with one another. So we don't communicate with one another about what's going on with each other. We can't do the caring, right? And so I think one of the things that's happened over the last nearly 2 years now is building over time this community of care. And so even what we're doing through Sanad, everybody being here today, for example, all these sessions, this is part of building that community of care. So think about that with one another. When we have the breakout sessions, feel free to reach out to one another, connect if you feel comfortable doing that. But these are all part of movement work, all of this. So as we finish out the last few minutes before we do the breakout sessions, we'll look back at last week's 2 vignettes, if you remember them. We'll bring them back up. And we'll look at them as examples now of how to use some of these strategies. Like, what would that actually look like? How would that play out? So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so you all remember, free the pin. Okay, a pediatric RN is wearing a watermelon pin. She's called into her supervisor's office where the nurse manager is unexpectedly also present. She's told of an anonymous complaint. The identity of the complainant cannot be shared with her in order to protect the complainant from any retaliation. The pin is making patients uncomfortable. It violates our unit policy of no political statements. You'll have to remove it or possibly face disciplinary action. Okay. So here's one scenario of how it could play out if you were the pediatric RN. Okay. So before attending the meeting, after being summoned, okay, the courageous RN emails the supervisor to express inability to meet at that particular time, but does offer several alternative time slots within a couple days of the summoned time. So what is this? This is to shift the power dynamic. It seems like a small thing, but it does actually shift the power dynamic. If accommodated, our courageous healthcare worker is now meeting on her own time. This taking control of time is actually a trauma-informed technique of reclaiming agency, voice, and choice. And I've taught this technique to patients of mine who have a history of trauma and who are going into some sort of administrative meeting where it's not going to be a supportive environment, might be a hostile environment. How do we problem solve to maintain control and agency even in that situation? Okay, so in this case, the meeting time is changed to the next day, the afternoon. Okay, the courageous RN emails to request the agenda, right? So not just, here's the summons, you need to show up, and meet with us. Wait a second. Can you share with me the agenda for the meeting? And the RN also requests in writing and through the email to have a peer present. So again, this then, if you're unionized, if you're not unionized, there may be considerations this way. But for those who are not unionized, even then request a peer, someone who's supportive to be in the role of a witness or somebody who can offer a helpful perspective in your favor. Okay, all of this is in writing so far. So the supervisor emails back a vague agenda and the request for a peer is denied. But now both of those occurrences are now on record in writing. As the meeting begins, The courageous RN is not surprised by the addition of the nurse manager, right? It's a predictable power play. So immediately the nurse recognizes this. As the meeting begins, the courageous RN requests to record the meeting. The request is denied. Okay. So the courageous nurse takes notes as best as she can, specifically focusing on broad themes and specific quotes. So if there are themes that come up that would have to do with policy or have to do with attitudes that are being shared with you that the the medical institution is trying to establish, for example, you've created a really difficult situation for us. We are very concerned about professionalism, any of these claims, right? These big, broad brushstrokes, any of these things that you might hear, write all of it down, right? And then if you get any quotes, especially, so in situations that I've been in, I've been careful to listen to what is being said, write it down. And then after every single meeting, I always summarize it. I don't offer my commentary on it. I just summarize for the record, here's what was said. And I think that's a really important thing to do as part of accountability. Nothing should happen that is unaccounted for or stays hidden. And by summarizing it yourself, you have some control in the situation. In response to the specific statement that the PIN makes patients uncomfortable and violates unit policy, the courageous RN refutes the claim and requests the concrete evidence to support it. Predictably enough, none is provided. The courageous RN requests that the policy referred to be provided in writing, along with the rationale for the alleged violation. So show me your thought process, right? Show your work. If I'm going to be accused of something, write the actual policy, cite what it is, and then actually walk through your thought process, HR director, supervisor, director, whoever it is, nurse manager, of how you got to the point of concluding that I was in violation of that policy. Make them show their work. Again, there's no merit to it, and it will come across as absurd. Now look at the last part of it, the threat. When told to remove the PIN or face disciplinary action, the courageous RN reminds her interlocutors that she is within her rights to wear the PIN, and that threatening with disciplinary action is actually a hostile threat and might constitute a violation of policy in and of itself by creating a hostile environment. So again, this idea of engaging at the point of that you want to, where you are asserting your reality. Because when you demand accountability through saying, well, show me your work. Well, what is the policy? Well, what's the thought process? Well, where's the evidence? How many people? Who came up to you and complained? Usually they can never give you all that detail. And if they did, it would look absurd because it wouldn't lead to the conclusion that you violated any policy. So this is that idea of being courageous, standing on your right to your reality and not being intimidated or bullied. Next slide. Okay, so this is the second example we had last week. It's the example of an internal medicine resident helping to host a fundraiser for Palestinian children's medical relief. After placing flyers in staff areas, the courageous intern is summoned by the program director for an urgent matter. The director is livid, holding the flyer, and then rails into this diatribe. It's unacceptable to have such a biased event. The event, not even talking about the Israelis who were assaulted during the Hamas terror attack. This event will not be sponsored or allowed on the premises without also having a space for the October 7th survivors. You are not in compliance with our DEI code of professionalism to be fair and inclusive of all people. And then proceeds to actually tear the flyer apart and throw it. As a reminder, these examples are an amalgam of things that have actually happened. Okay, so all of this goes down, right, in the administrator's office. So after the diatribe by the director, the courageous intern, understandably, spends the rest of that evening and much of the next day just grounding and connecting in supportive spaces. Think about, again, communities of care. This is why it's so important to be connected. Supportive spaces with other courageous healthcare workers, family, allies in the community, making sure the verbal abuse and the belligerent behavior of the director is not kept secret within the confines of the hospital. Now, one of the things that's unique to the work that we do as healthcare workers and advocacy, so much is happening behind closed doors within the hospitals, right? So a lot of the public don't know what's going on inside of our hospitals, but we know so much is happening. And so we have to very intentionally make sure that we are connecting to the community and making sure that we are telling the community transparently what is happening inside of the hospitals whenever any of these kind of weapons are used against us, right? So after grounding, the courageous intern remembers that gaslighting thrives on isolation, and so makes the intentional effort not to isolate. We just talked about that. So in community, able to identify how he feels, recognizing feelings of confusion and anger about the accusation of professionalism. He's able to separate from his thoughts, separate from his feelings enough to start looking at the function of the accusation. Now, remember last week we talked about recognize what the function of the weapon is, like trace it out to its natural conclusion. He realizes that the goal is to eliminate the fundraiser. It has nothing to do with inclusion or professionalism. He recognizes this pattern as a classic tactic of gaslighting to shut down advocacy, especially in this particular case, especially when it had the potential to make other healthcare workers courageous too, right? This was a really big deal. Putting on an event that would attract more healthcare workers, those who perhaps weren't yet as courageous to speak up on their own, but maybe they would be had they been in community. So it starts to make sense. Some of the most hostile retaliation happens because we're about to engage in the most powerful actions. So let's see. Okay, so what's the other really practical benefit of being in community as part of movement work? Now in connection with allies in the community, our courageous intern now has options to pressure the hospital to allow the event to happen. And there's a whole strategy that can happen from the community to do that, or to shift the event to the community itself outside of the hospital with widespread support, right? And most importantly, now the public knows that the Children's Hospital tried to thwart a fundraiser for children surviving trauma from genocide in need of medical and surgical care. We've seen this play out over and over again, where events are canceled or in some way met with retaliation. And when you spell it out, it's absurd. But this is the position, this is the racist position that our medical institutions have taken. And when we make that public, that's incredibly powerful. So in this case, surprisingly, the director doesn't call our courageous intern back in after the event for another meeting. The hospital would rather not be in the news again. All right, folks. We will take just a couple minutes and break into our small groups. If you have an example that you have recognized from last week to this week of an instance where you experienced weaponization in some form of either DEI or professionalism or some such, if you've had any of that happen where you can identify the weapons of the institution used against you, go ahead and bring that example up in the small group and we can work through that if that would be helpful to you. We also have a couple vignettes already set up if folks want to work through those two examples together and do role playing with it. Everybody will have a chance to practice utilizing their strategies and practicing some skills to navigate through the scenarios. Remember, all of these situations, the end goal is to repress our advocacy, right? To stop us from mobilizing together and building that avalanche of support in order to end genocide.